What if the gods of ancient Babylon were not myths, but fallen angels? You know the Bible story of Daniel, a faith empires cannot break, but you've never experienced it like this. The Daniel Trilogy by best-selling author Brian Godawa, part of the Chronicles of the Watchers, a series of supernatural biblical novels charting the influence of spiritual warfare on human history. Jezebel, Moses, Judah Maccabee, and now the Daniel Trilogy. The first novel, Daniel, Exile in Babylon, available in ebook, paperback, and audiobook at Amazon.com. Chronicles of the Watchers by Brian Godawa at Amazon.com.
Hey everybody, welcome back to That's So Fringy podcast. I am here with my good friend Brian Godawa. You guys know him from all of his books that he has come on and talked about. Hopefully you've been following along on this podcast for long enough to know that Brian is a guest that has returned multiple times to talk about his Chronicle of the Watchers series and the Nephilim series and all of the things. And we've also done some spin-offs and talked more about his End Times Bible prophecy books and things like that. So you guys should know him pretty well by now. But Brian, I wanted to welcome you and say, how are you today?
Good, Rick. Thanks for having me on. I'm happy to be here and excited to talk about this most amazing Bible hero, Daniel.
Yeah, it's amazing. We were just talking offline, and you had reached out about your new book, which I didn't know that you were working on. Obviously you're always working on something, as we all are, but I didn't know what you were working on. And you asked, do you want to talk about my new book about Daniel? And my Bible study had just finished Daniel, and it was such a great kind of a God moment for me, because I was like, yes, I do. This is fresh on my brain. I'm ready for that. So without further ado, let's jump into it. Tell us a little bit about this. So this is a story about the life of Daniel from the Bible.
Yeah. What makes this different, right? Because we've heard this a 1,000 times, and they're trying to make a movie about him right now, and everything. So, well, my series is Chronicles of the Watchers, and the premise of the series is it's integrated with a previous series, Chronicles of the Nephilim. And what I'm doing in these series is I'm retelling Bible stories where the Watchers or the Nephilim or the giants or those strange things in the Bible come up, because I see them all as part of a interesting, consistent storyline through the Bible that I call the War of the Seed. But it does include some basic concepts of the spiritual world and spiritual warfare. One of those ideas is the notion of the Watchers, Chronicles of the Watchers. The notion is that, the Bible says in many places, Psalm 82 for one, and Deuteronomy 32, it talks about how at the Tower of Babel, God, he separates the nations, which we now know as the Gentile nations of Genesis 10. There were 70 of them there in Genesis, right? And he says that, when he did that separation, he apportioned them or allotted them to the sons of God, according to the number of the sons of God. Who are the sons of God? Well, you look back into Genesis 6, you see that they're the heavenly host from God's throne that left his throne and came to earth, violated this heavenly earthly separation between, women and humans and angels, and they mated with them and created the Nephilim. That was this rebellious lot that with the flood, those were imprisoned in Tartarus and Hades, and they're going to, to be judged at a later date. But then later at Babel, when God, places the Gentile nations, after the flood, man still continues to worship idols. And so God says, okay, I'm going to give you over to them, right? It's like, you want to follow these gods? I'll let them rule over you, right? And see what you get. And But Israel, he says, from I am the watcher of Israel. I am the God of Israel. They will be my inheritance, but the nations will have these sons of God as their inheritance. And so I'm using the word watcher in exchange with sons of God. Just think of the term as meaning roughly watchers over the nations. They watch over the nations, right? That's a rough, or a very rough definition, but it kind of makes sense. It helps you understand that there's so much more to it than that, right? But the idea there is just that the biblical idea that through the Old Testament, these Gentile nations were under these authority and powers that are called princes. In the book of Daniel, chapter 10, we read about the prince of Persia, the prince of Greece, and the prince of Israel. And these are clearly spiritual principalities, not earthly princes. They're spiritual powers that are over the earthly powers, and they're connected in some way. In a sense, what happens on earth happens in heaven. They're reflected in each other. And where I get that from is literally from the book of Daniel. Like I said, there are other places where this shows up, but just as a good case example, that Daniel 10, where we read about the prince of Persia, fought against Michael, who's the prince of Israel, but then the prince of Greece will come and battle with the prince of Persia. What's going on there, right? What's going on? Well, the context there is, remember, and this is what leads into the whole understanding Daniel from 30,000 feet. The whole context of Daniel is Israel is being brought into exile because of her rebellion against Yahweh for so long, for 70 years, and then they're going to be brought back. But while they're there, God doesn't change his mind, but he adds a new dimension to their judgment. He says, okay, you're going to come back from exile after 70 years, but for 70 times 7 years, you are going to be under the thumb of Gentile powers. God's kingdom, or the people of God, will be under the thumb of Gentile kingdoms, which of course is abhorrent in their context, right? But God is making a point, and he's saying, but I will lift that when Messiah comes. And through Daniel, we read through these various prophecies, the prophecy of the statue with the multi-metals, and then the 4 beasts from the sea, which is a recapitulation. We learn that he's saying, look, they're in exile under Babylon, and that's the first kingdom in this plan. And the kingdom is Babylon. And then the second kingdom that will come and rule over them will be the Medo-Persian kingdom. Then after that comes the kingdom of Greece, and then lastly, Rome. And sure enough, in history, those were the outgrowth of the kingdoms, one after another. Of course, Babylon was ultimately overthrown by the Medo-Persians with Cyrus. And then the Persian kingdom was later, in 300 BC, was overthrown by Alexander the Great. And he was the Macedonian Greek kingdom. And then ultimately Rome overcame the Greek kingdom. And so and then Messiah comes. That's where Daniel 2 talks about Messiah. The stone cut without hands hits the statue right at the base where the Roman kingdom is. And the concept there is that God will bring his kingdom that will will crush all other kingdoms historically. It will take time because it will grow to be a mountain to fill the earth, but it will grow. It will take time. And that's the big picture. So Daniel's saying, so fear not, God will fulfill his promises, but it's going to be in these 490 years. And then a lot of his prophecies describes the history that's going to occur until that time of Messiah. So we've got this context, right? Now going back to the watcher paradigm, what does this mean? Well, we know that Daniel at that time, around the time of Daniel 10, is the time when the Persian kingdom's in power. And what's the kingdom that comes after that? Greece. So when he says the prince of Persia will come and come be in conflict with the prince of Greece will come and be in conflict with the prince of Persia, that's a reference to the historical fact of the Greek kingdom also being in conflict with the Persian kingdom. So you see how what's going on in the heavenly realm reflects what's going on in the earthly realm. If there's a battle on earth, there's a battle in heaven. And that's the basic concept. And, I've written other books where I lay out all the biblical passages for this. But that's the basic concept that I'm doing is, so I'm retelling these Bible stories. I'm staying as true as I can. And I do with Daniel. But we know that sometimes like books like Daniel are missing a lot. Like they have highlights. Daniel's in Babylon for 70 years. Sure. And it only tells a few highlights out of each of those decades, right? And so there's a lot that we don't know. Well, what I try to do is I try to retell the story of Daniel and try to help make sense of it by filling in with fiction and some speculation about how those highlights that we know about in Daniel, how do they connect together historically and biblically? And at the same time, I'm drawing the curtain back from the spiritual world and I'm saying, okay, what might be going on in the spiritual realm? We get these little, glimpses, right? Like Daniel 10, etc. And there's other passages as well, but we get these glimpses of the spiritual world, but not a lot of detail. So necessarily I'm speculating. And what I'm doing is I'm telling a story of like, okay, these sons of God, angels, they're being the premise of my story is, what if the gods of the ancient world that we know about, Baal is the god of Canaan, and of course there was Anat and Asherah in Canaan, many gods everywhere, right? Mm-hmm. Zeus in Greece. But in Babylon, it was Marduk and Ishtar and Nabu, and in Egypt, Amun-Ra and Horus. So you've got all these gods and religions. Well, I thought, well, what if those gods of the ancient world were not just myth, but they're myths and legends rooted in some real, actual spiritual reality? And I'm not just making this up either, because the Bible hints at that when it talks about in Deuteronomy 32:17, where, Moses says that, Israel will go into the land of Canaan and they will fall away from Yahweh. They will worship the gods of Canaan. And it says that they will, they will worship the gods, that were not God, and they are shedim, or they are demons. Mm-hmm. And I don't think the word demons there means exactly the way we understand demons today. It basically was a territorial power or territorial spirit. And in the ancient world, non-Jewish religions, they thought they could be good or evil. But the Jewish concept is they're evil because they're Gentile nations and they hate God. And so they're worshiping they're worshiping these gods of Canaan. And he's saying there's a demonic reality behind them. Now, does that mean there's a one-to-one, like for every god that exists in the mythology, there's an actual spiritual being? No, I don't think so. Of course, there's a lot of made up stuff. And of course, my premise is that they're masquerading and they're lying, they're deceiving. Satan disguises himself like an angel of light, right? So I have this concept of these gods of that world are actually the fallen angels that God apportioned the nations to be under their powers, right? So that's the big story. And I'm like, well, what kind of stories would go on with that? Well, I'm telling Daniel's story, and at the same time, I'm going in, well, what did Marduk and Nabu are doing, or the demonic beings, what were they doing? Because if you think about it, they're like in Daniel 10, like they're battling each other. So they have their own goals and things that they want, right? Mm-hmm. They're personal beings. They're spiritual, but they're personal. So they've got different personality types. So imagine the mafia, a spiritual mafia. They're going to be united in their hatred and battle against God, but they're also going to be fighting amongst themselves.
Sure. Yeah.
So I bring storylines, and I do that in Daniel as well. What might be going on, in a way that reflects what's going on historically. So I connect the history with the mythology. And so when you read my stories, you're going to be entertained with the spiritual warfare, but you're going to learn a lot about the Babylonian understanding of religion and mythology. So I bring that stuff into play in the spiritual realm. right?
Yeah, it's important to build that context, right? It's important to help people understand like what is actually going on, not only biblically, but what is going on really in the spiritual realm all around us today. And so it's cool that you build that context, and thank you for doing that just now, because you build a lot of context and help people to understand that not only are your novels fun to read and exciting, and it's like reading C.S. Lewis or reading Lord of the Rings or Narnia or those type of things. It's using a little bit of creative license to tell a story that is also very true. Now, everything that you're putting in your book isn't truth, it's not biblically, but we have to remember that it's
consistent with the Bible.
Exactly. It's consistent with the Bible. And some people, they get a little, weak in the knees, and they're like, I don't know, I don't want to read that because I don't want to get too far away from the Bible. That's not true. But this has been happening for a very long time. In fact, you can argue that most stories all throughout history have a little bit of truth in the Bible, because of this is the story as old as time, right? It's the story as old as time. So with this book, this is going to be the first book in a trilogy, as I understand it. And but this first book, you're not going to really go deep into the prophecy portion. You're going to kind of be building. Is that correct? You're going to be building the worldview.
Yeah. So I thought, well, what's the story to tell? And I started realizing this is deep and heavy because there's a lot of prophecy and a lot of beloved stories like The Lion's Den. And I realized this is going to take more than one novel. And so it's going to be a trilogy, but, I also kind of, I know that the whole prophecy thing is deep and rich, and it's connected to my other novels, Chronicles of the Apocalypse, which has to do with the book of Revelation. So there are these connections going on and such, right? And, my view is not the typical Left Behind type of view that a lot of people believe, dispensationalism and all that kind of stuff. I have a very different view of that. But, so I thought, okay, but there's another element of it that I thought, you know what, I got to tell this story first. And that's the first 3 years of Daniel's schooling in the school of the magi. Now, the word magi is simply the Persian word for wise men. And so, in the Babylonian times, they were called wise men. The school where they learned was actually called the school of the tablet in actual history. And so what I thought was the reason why I thought I had to tell that is because when you read Daniel 1, it's really amazing. It's really quick. It just, like I said, it just highlights, and it says, he was deported. And then after 3 years, he learned the language and literature of the Chaldeans with his 3 friends, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, whose actual Jewish names are Azariah, Mishael, and Hananiah. So, and at the end of that, we read the king says that you're 10 times better than all my magicians and sorcerers. And I'm like, and wise men. And I'm like, wait a minute. This is weird, because it's like Daniel, we know is a Torah observant Jew. He's obedient to God. He won't compromise. How is it then that he can be taught and to be all the forbidden arts, basically, of divination, astrology, exorcism, all these components, which was part of being, as well as being a scribe, and as well as learning the literature and the language. That's all part of the package, And I thought, well, what does that mean? How is that possible? And so I really felt like I had to explore that, because that's the whole foundation of everything that happens afterwards, right? Yes. So that's when I realized, okay, this is the story about Daniel 1 in one novel, but it's the 3 years, and so it focuses on that. So yeah, the prophecy comes in the later novels, but it ends up kind of being, he's like about 15, 16 years old, so it's kind of like Harry Potter meets God, because Daniel's going to magician school, magic school, right? And to learn all the occultic stuff. And, like I said, I wrestle with, how is it that you can learn this stuff and know it and understand it and yet not participate in it? And that's one of the things that the story kind of works through. And so, yeah. And, so like I say, it's just this exciting, interesting time period. And it starts when Daniel is deported. So he starts in Jerusalem, and then he's ultimately deported. Now, I also bring in a love story for Daniel, where he has fallen in love. He's young, but he's fallen in love with his servant, who's a Jewish girl who serves his family is in Jerusalem, so that when he's deported, they're split apart. And they're longing to trying to get back together. How, be illegal for either of them to escape. And so how can they get back to each other? And that's a part of the storyline, because, in the book of Daniel, we don't read anything about any women in there, but that doesn't mean there weren't women, right?
Yeah.
And for whatever reason, God doesn't go into that, but I wanted to integrate that because I love stories, romance, and, marriage and such. So I incorporated that in a way that when you read it, it will still make sense with the Daniel that we know, right?
Yeah.
And how we see, he's, with all these students, male students being in this school, how could he ever really have a relationship with a woman? Well, this makes sense. And it allows me to do another thing, which is I can bounce back and forth between Babylon and Jerusalem, where his beloved is, because one of the interesting components of the exile was Daniel wasn't the only prophet of the exile. There's several others, including Jeremiah and Ezekiel. And so Ezekiel doesn't start till they get into Babylon, but Jeremiah had been preaching in Jerusalem, and he stays there the whole time, even after the exile and the destruction of the city. And so I'm like, what would that be like? Right. The Daniel and Jeremiah at the same time in different locations. And so I'm able to do that through this technique, of separating him from his beloved, sort of thing.
Yeah, that's awesome to be able to build that context back and forth, because when you're just reading the Bible, it's sometimes you forget that there are other prophets living at the very same time, speaking this, very similar messages about faithfulness to God, faithfulness to the Torah, those type of things. And so it's good to build that, a good creative way to do that, where you you get another picture of what's going on in a different area. So that's actually pretty cool.
Not only that, but I've always had a hard time following Jeremiah and Ezekiel and some of the prophets, because, you understand the generic thing, because God will be condemning this nation, that nation, or Israel, right, for her unfaithfulness. But it's just sort of like rambling on. And you're like, well, where is this? Where does this fit in? And sometimes it tells you a context. But in general, Jeremiah is not in chronological order. It jumps back and forth. So you don't know where you're at half the time. And so it's hard to place these prophecies in a way that's sort of like you can read them in a way that hits home. Oh, this is what's going on. This is what he's talking about, or whatever. And so by retelling Jeremiah's story and placing it in that historical storyline, it allows me the ability to say, this is what was going on. And then this is when he was preaching that. And, it sort of brings alive the exile, because the exile is one thing that I've always been intrigued by. It's the center point of a lot of biblical theology, because it becomes the center point of the Old Testament, where Israel is punished in such a way that God says, this is it. I'm done with you, but I'm not done. I'm going to bring Messiah, and ultimately I'm going to fix this. But it becomes a symbol of what disobedience to God results in. And Babylon becomes one of the biggest ultimate symbols of evil in the Bible. Like, they'll just use it generically just to talk about evil. It'd be Babylon. So much so that in Revelation, you get Babylon is used symbolically as well of the ultimate, hater of God at that point. And so, so the, contextualization, I like to make the story come alive, and particularly those components that are kind of a jumble as we're reading the Bible.
I'm sure you've added some more context to the friends, right? You don't really get a lot about these guys. Obviously, they play a pretty big role in the book of Daniel at the beginning, but they're kind of in for a little bit and then they're out, and they have this really big moment, but you don't really get to know them at all. Did you play with that a little bit as well? I'm sure. Yeah.
So Daniel's going into this school with these fellow Jews, right? And so he's spending 3 years with them, and they're in schooling, dorm room rooms and all that kind of stuff. And I thought, yeah, this is an interesting opportunity to really do a story about friends and how they stick together. But it's kind of like a high school coming of age movie, you know?
Yeah.
One of them, like you said, we don't know anything about them. So I crafted stories that would help, support Daniel's story and make sense and be interesting and connect with the Bible. And, each character is their own unique character. One of them is a jock. He's not as smart of a scribe as the others. One of them is autistic. It's one of my little Easter eggs in there where he struggles with, which creates some problems, of course, plot wise, but also it becomes a blessing that God uses that specialness to actually bring about some amazing things that without revealing too much plot, right? It becomes a key point, and that character becomes actually a very more significant character than I had even anticipated. So people are really going to enjoy that. I try to make it, as realistic as possible what autism might look like in that day. And then his brother is the other Jewish guy, so he's protective of his brother, Yeah. And so each of them have their own different struggles that they're dealing with. And Daniel's struggle is also important because, we know Daniel is this, this uncompromising kid. Well, he's not sinless. Nobody's sinless but Jesus, right? And so we all have flaws. And so I thought, well, what might Daniel have been like before he became that mature, that conviction oriented, right? How might he have grown? And that's what I'm trying to do in this story as well, is show here's a young kid he's in the noble line of Judah, right? So he's in the royal line. So he's got that royal blood, and maybe he has a little bit high view of himself, and maybe I can become king one day, and wouldn't that be cool? That kind of a thing. And then he gets ripped apart from that, loses it all, becomes a slave for the rest of his life, right?
Yeah.
But then we know how God uses him, but first God has to break him before he can use him in that way. And another theme that I'm dealing with in this story is, what about the little people? Daniel's a story about the big purposes of God, kingdoms, and how God, orchestrates kings and kingdoms and the important people. But what about the little people? What about the slaves that live their lives and suffer and die?
Yeah.
Does God care for them? Well, we can say, oh yeah, he does. But I wanted to wrestle through that issue and have, as Daniel becomes a slave and a nobody, but he's in love with a girl who's a nobody. And they're struggling with this. Okay, God cares about the kings, but what about the little people? Where is he for us? You know what I mean?
Sure.
And that's been a real thing in my own life, in terms of just trying to understand God's ways. I don't question him in that. It's just like, how does this work, God? And how do you care about the lowly and the meek and such? And so that was also another theme that I try to wrestle through as Daniel is being prepared to ultimately be used in a great and mighty way.
Well, that's good, because that's all of us, right? Most of us are the little people. And it's hard for us to read the Bible sometimes because we try to relate with these major figures, but we're not that guy. We're the lowly. We are the ones that are mostly part of the nation. If we were walking into exile, we'd be walking in the back. We wouldn't be walking in the front, and so that's awesome and helpful that you do that, because sometimes we see ourselves actually as much bigger than we really are. And to find ourselves,
we see ourselves as the heroes of our own story. That's a natural tendency, because we are the perception in our world, right? Mm-hmm. But you're right. It creates this thing of but it also, I think it sometimes creates a false sort of expectation on us, where it's God has great plans for me. What's it going to be? And look at Billy Graham, and look at all these, Christian ministers who do great and mighty things and whatever, and missionaries and all this. And it's like, we tend to think we're all going to have like you say, most of us don't have that. But we have this mistaken perception that because I try so hard and I do this or that, but I don't rise in influence. I don't become an influencer, It's like, does that mean God's not using me? No, you have to understand how God is involved in each and every one of our lives. And the fact that he may use some people for bigger things doesn't make them bigger people.
No,
It just makes them more fortunate.
In fact, when you meet some of those bigger names, you'd be surprised.
They're very much normal like us, and often don't deserve that
yeah, exactly.
position. I've been there myself. I don't deserve some of the accolades that I've achieved in my life. I look back and go, yeah, I don't deserve that. I just thank God that he used me, and I'm still a desperate sinner who needs him daily for forgiveness.
So obviously you're doing large amounts of research to put all this together. You can obviously come up with a lot of the stuff that is fiction. That's fun to do. That's the fun part. But to keep it grounded in the word, like you said, to keep it grounded in scripture, you have to do a lot of not only Bible work, which you've done over the years, but you have to do a lot of historical work. Is there anything that you have learned about, this journey through Daniel and the historical portion of it that stood out to you, or anything that was new that you didn't know, or anything like that?
Yeah, a lot. But coming into it, you have to understand, Daniel is one of the most attacked books in the Bible for whatever reason by liberals. Well, I think I know the reason, because his prophecies are among the most detailed, accurate prophecies that we have. Like, prophecies can be very symbolic and very difficult to interpret, like Ezekiel and such. And Daniel's are symbolic too, but they match history so exactly that liberal theologians have spent a lot of time and energy to try to discredit it as being a book that was not written in the days of Daniel by Daniel, but was written long after the historic events occurred. So they're pretending it was prophesied by writing back 300 years earlier, pretending it was prophesying, if that makes sense, right?
Yeah,
so the liberal theory is this was written around the time of the Maccabees, the 2nd century BC, under the Greek kingdom, right? So a lot of stuff has already happened, and now because he knows all the history, he can go back and recast it as if what they call it Vaticinium ex eventu, after the event, prophecy after the event, and that's the typical liberal approach, and they have some arguments. So I just out of my own personal interest, I'm like, okay, what is this? How does this answer and all that? And in the course that I find a lot of historical facts, because they miss a lot of historical things. They misinterpret things. So, there's several things, one of them, without becoming too, overwhelmed with details, there's an argument that, it was written in a Greek time period. And, which is time of the Maccabees. Now we have books that were written in the Maccabees time period as well. And, so they say there are Greek loanwords in there, and Persian loanwords as well. And therefore that reflects the fact that it's written in a later time period. Well, when you look into it, you find out, wait a minute, there's only 3 Greek words in there. And by the way, there are foreign loanwords in all the Bible because cultures interacted with each other. They borrowed words all the time, right? So that's normal. And at that time period, the Greek kingdom was around, and so was Assyria, and so was the Hittites, and so there's going to be that, and Persia was around. But what's interesting is when you find out where those words occur, they occur in the chapter where it talks about, I think it's chapter, 3 or 4, where, the statue, he makes the gold statue and says, when the music plays, bow down and worship it, right? Well, it's the musical instruments are Greek words. That's it.
Oh, sure.
And it just so happens that there were Greek instruments that were also, had been in the Levant and in the Mesopotamian. So that's possible. But what's interesting, it's much more interesting than that, because there's also Persian words that are used in that chapter. And Persia has also not yet arrived, right? And those Persian words are in reference to the governorship, like the satraps and stuff. So what some scholars have pointed out is there's a deliberate polemic going on here where he's deliberately he's saying this is happening in the time of Babylon. but he knows about Daniel's prophecies about the coming kingdoms. So at the time when Nebuchadnezzar is making a statue of his own greatness and glory, where he's trying to say that I'm going to make a statue of gold, of all gold, and it's, maybe it was even him. If you remember, the dream he had was he was the head of gold, then the chest of silver, then bronze midsection, then the legs of iron and clay, right?
Yeah.
Well, he's making the whole statue gold, kind of like saying, screw these other kingdoms. I'm the greatest of all, right? And so in a way, the writer is mocking him. Daniel's mocking him by letting the readers remember that Greek is yet to come, the Greek instruments, and Persian rulers, Persia's yet to come. So you think you're this great mighty ruler, but these other kingdoms are already reflected in the language I'm using to show you that you're going to ultimately be overthrown as well. Yeah. So that's just one literary way of realizing a lot of the things that liberals come up to try to say, oh, the Bible's not reliable. Fascinating. Yeah, and these aren't like just, desperate ploys to try to make things harmonize. It's like, no, there's a real reason why you see what these anomalies from our perspective, where they're coming from. There's one other thing. I don't know if it's so much liberal, but there's definitely one view of Daniel that Daniel was a eunuch. When you read chapter 1, it talks about their captives. Right. The chief of the eunuchs, Ashpenaz, gathers them together. So there's a good argument that Daniel may have been a eunuch. Well, I did research into that because I'm like, well, a eunuch love story wouldn't work very well, right? So is there some possibility that he wasn't? Just give me a 20-30% possibility. I'm fine with that. But I was shocked to find out that no, it's the opposite. In fact, I'm 95% sure that he wasn't a eunuch because of the fact that the whole system and institution of the wise men was a separate institution from the palace and from, like Babylon would capture slaves and put them in the palace as servants. Well, they don't want them mixing with the blood of the royalty, right? So they make them eunuchs and they don't want them attacking the harem. But the wise men were a complete separate institution. They weren't in the palace and they all had families. They had family legacies, that were, I actually found Babylonian literature by wise men that talk about this, that talk about their families and stuff. So wow. It's a legacy thing. And then lastly, I also found literature where it literally talked about the restrictions of wise men. A wise man would have to be without blemish and no leprosy, no loss of body parts, and not a eunuch. So that's why Nebuchadnezzar was saying, give me these noblemen without blemish. Like, why would he say that? Well, by reading the Babylonian literature, I find out, it's because the wise men were supposed to be kind of holy, kind of separate, right? But that means they couldn't be a eunuch. So it wouldn't make sense for him to make sure they're not eunuchs and then make them eunuchs, number one, right?
Right.
But secondly, also, it's just, that would make them not a wise man because it blows the restrictions, Sure. And so, that was something that was really interesting that I hadn't anticipated, that, these little things that you learn along.
Yeah. Well, I'm excited to read through this, man. I'm excited for all of your novels every time one comes out, but this one in particular, because I was telling you, we just got done with Daniel, so the imagination is already flowing for me. And I know a lot of our listeners and probably your readers, they're already fascinated with the book of Daniel. It's such a major book, and there's so much, like you said, the lion's den and the fiery furnace and all of these. You already kind of have this very imaginative world that you have to create in your mind to be able to just read the book of Daniel. So it's so awesome that you're pulling that out. And one thing that I noticed when I was on your website is that you have a cast of characters tab on your website. And so could you talk about that a little bit? Yeah.
So every novel I do, I cast them like a movie. That's my background, right? I love movies and I love to cast my characters. And now with AI, it enables me to really make a character exactly how I want them. And so you go to my website, Godawa.com, click on the Daniel book, and there's a little tab that says cast of characters. And I show most of the main characters in the story. Now, when the book comes out, they'll have all the characters, but most of them will be for free on the internet, so you can take a gander at them. And for those who like a little bit of help of picturing them in their mind while they're reading, it's a great tool. And I got the gods in there, the archangels, all kinds of really cool characters. It's some fun, and the demonic beings and all that kind of stuff. So
that's awesome, because a lot of times you do read a book and you make it up in your head. That's kind of on you as the reader to make it up in your head. But
some people prefer that.
Yeah,
I don't. I actually don't. I like to read a book that I've seen a good series on television about, because then I can picture those characters as they're, otherwise sometimes I can't remember the names. There's so many names in these books, it's like this character, that character, you lose track. But if you remember the character in the series, it helps you remember them.
Well, that's cool. And before, when we've talked, you've always had kind of like a companion piece, that went along with it to link it back to the Bible in a very, powerful way. Are you doing that with these novels as well?
Yeah, I am. It's a book that's going to be called, The Spiritual World of Daniel and Babylon. And you'll see an ad for that in the book when you get it, but it's not quite available. It's going to be available when the second one comes out, because I've got to put in all the research for all three of the books into that one book. At least I think I'm going to do that, but there's a lot of research. So yeah, I go into all these things like the liberal arguments and some of the fascinating things about Babylonian ancient mythology and their gods and how that interacts with Israel and all that stuff. Absolutely. It started as something I did for myself, and I still do it for myself. Like when I'm doing my research, I actually write most of the research book before I write the novel. Most of it, not all of it, but
yeah,
because that helps me get a handle on it. So then when I'm telling the story, I have a better handle. So it's kind of for me in a way. But over time, people have said they really, really love those. They love to have the theology explained, and hey, that's fine with me. So, not everybody buys that. Some people just love the story, and that's the novel, and that's fine. But for those who do, it will be coming out with the second novel.
That's awesome. And so this book is out now, coming out soon?
Yes.
Where are we at in the process?
Now, exclusively at Amazon in Kindle, paperback, hardcover, large print, and within a week or so, it's going to be on Audible audiobook. So it'll be on all formats, and very cheap on Kindle. So my gosh, it's the prices that you get on digital books are just fantastic. So, but every format and exclusively there.
Okay, awesome. And are you going to be reading this one as well?
Yeah, I am. I
love that you do that. That's so cool.
I enjoy it. I love getting into the story like for the 10th time, but this time I'm doing the characters and it's fun. I think this is probably my best story yet. I really do, because it's got everything. My editor was telling me that. My first readers are telling me that, because this has just it's entertaining. It's got a great plot, but it also has a lot of biblical background and a lot of the ancient Near Eastern background that ties it all together. And it's like I said, it hasn't quite gotten into the prophecy yet, but it's building that foundation. It's getting you in that direction. So yeah, it's going to be really. One other thing I do too is, I have them go through their schooling of divination and of astrology. And, so you learn a little bit about what those ancient worlds were like. And, astrology is one of the things that we hear that word and we think horoscopes, which are goofy, silly. And that's really not what it was in the ancient world. The horoscopes didn't start until like 200 BC or later. In the ancient world, they believed that the stars were divine, but they saw the regularity of nature, and they believed that they just had influence on humanity. And so they kept track of them also. Like they would read omens, like if there's an eclipse, it might be an omen for this or that. But they rooted that based on keeping track of the regularity of it all. And then they saw historical events and started to make connections. Yes, it's condemned in scripture. Absolutely. And it's wrong in that sense. But that doesn't mean astronomy is wrong, which means it doesn't mean it's wrong to study the constellations. When you hear the word zodiac, that doesn't mean the goofy horoscopes. Zodiac is just the term of the 12 specific constellations that are actually on that ecliptic that we see, that we go through regularly in the sky, but there are many other constellations. And all it means is the ancients gave names to constellations and sort of drew pictures by connecting the stars with dots to help them remember them, because they were constant, right? And that growth of the constellations, stayed relatively pretty. It's very much similar throughout all ancient cultures. There's some differences, of course, but there are some Christians, and I bring some of this into the novel because there are some Christian researchers and scholars who have argued that, for example, Bullinger, he's a famous evangelical old scholar, and he writes about how the 12 constellations starting with Virgo, the Virgin, right? And then ending with Leo, the lion of Judah, right?
Yeah.
That the gospel is actually in the 12 constellations. Talks about the two dual natures of Christ, his sacrifice as a ram like Capricornus and all this stuff. And this is not astrology. What this is the claim is, Psalm 19 says, the heavens are declaring the glory of God. They don't have words, but they are words. In other words, the gospel is in pictures. And Paul actually talks about this in Romans 10 when he's talking about the gospel. And he says, well, and what about those who haven't heard? And he goes, but haven't they heard? And he says, their voice has gone out throughout all the earth. They've all heard. And he's quoting Psalm 19, which is talking about the stars and constellations giving glory to God. And so this isn't a matter of just generic what do they call it? Natural revelation, right? God is general creator, etc. But it's special revelation, meaning the gospel itself, that God may have incorporated that into the constellations before we even had writing, so that it would always be a revolving picture around us throughout all of our eternal existence on earth. That is, Yeah. And that's not astrology. That's God in control, placing his message in the stars. Basically.
Yeah. There's a difference between pattern recognition and worship, and trying to put something there from man, instead just being a witness of what is already there, and then recognizing those patterns. And I think that's where you can get into trouble, is when you're trying to make something happen, or you're trying to say those are holy and we're gonna worship those instead of the one true holy God. There is that difference between that. And so, and I mean, obviously the Magi were paying attention to something, because they end up in Bethlehem right at the right time, right at the right place.
And that's all connected. And that's one of the things that, if you think about it, we don't know what they were following a star. There are some Christian researchers who say that's not a supernatural thing. That was astronomical alignments that they're following. But it's really weird. Why would they expect the king of the world to come out of Israel? That's nowheresville, right? Well, they were probably influenced by Daniel. Daniel was a major influence for 70 years, set the standard, and he wrote about Messiah coming. So maybe all that stayed until even the first century, where those Parthian magi who learned about it, or Persian magi, I think they were in Babylon at the time. And, but we don't see, but the Bible doesn't say exactly how. So this is my attempt to say, well, this might be one way of understanding how that information was passed down.
Yeah, that's amazing. Well, Brian, thank you so much for taking the time to come on here and tell us all about this, because, your books have opened a lot of people's eyes, even though there are fiction leanings. People are learning about the Bible through your stories, and that's really good. Like we talked about earlier, being able to understand the story of Jeremiah, and understand the story of Daniel, and all of those different things. Being able to be excited about the Bible in a way that makes you go, oh, now I'm going to go into the Bible and see what the Bible actually says. Using your companion pieces to help them with that research is awesome. But all along the way, it's just fun. And there's nothing in the Bible that says don't have any fun while you're
exactly.
here.
Good man.
You're being faithful to the Lord. Yeah. You're wanting to be faithful and endure to the end, as Paul says. You're trying to run this race, and you're going through a lot of hardship here and there, trying to stay faithful. You've got the whole world trying to come against you because you're a Christian, and they don't love you. They don't like you. So why not have a little bit of fun and enjoy your time here while you endure until Christ either returns or you go to meet him in glory? Whatever is going to come first, we don't know.
Glorifying God can be fun.
That's right. That's right. So I just wanted to say thank you for doing what you're doing. It's amazing. And I'm glad that we've become friends over the years, and we're going to continue to have you on every time that you write a new book, because we're excited about it. And whether anybody listens to this podcast or not, we're still going to talk about it with you. So.
That's all right. Amen. All of us little people.
That's right.
God hears our podcast.
That's right. Well, Brian, thank you so much again. And
thank you, Rick.
Where can people find you? Godawa.com, is that right?
Yeah, Godawa.com. I try to make an interesting website, but you can just go straight to Amazon, and all the information's there too. So.
Excellent. All right, everybody. This has been Brian Godawa. Again, thank you so much for coming on, and we'll see you guys on the next one. Bye for now.